Welcome to the Trust in Web Archives panel. It's an invited panel and it will run for 1 hour. There were no videos to watch before the session, obviously. We will hear from our 4 panelists a short presentation about their work in the field, followed by questions and debate. And like in the other sessions, you will be able to ask your questions in text form in the Q&A tab in Remo. After this panel, Abby, the IIPC chair, will have some closing remarks for us. Afterwards, you can stay a bit in the networking mode in Remo, and we just talked to the panelists, and they're happy to stay on floor 2 to remain and discuss a bit with the audience if you want. Or you can use the IIPC WAC2021 Slack and continue the discussion there. So let me introduce the topic. Before we dive into the presentations, I will introduce the topic by deconstructing the title of this panel into its individual components. Trust in Web Archives. To paraphrase the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, trust is an attitude that allows us to depend on others for something. That something can be advice, it can be help with plumbing, or preservation of the historical record. It comes with a certain built-in risk, since trust can be betrayed. Therefore, we should only trust people, institutions, or processes which merit this trust. The second part of the title is Web Archives. A web archive can be a personal collection of work files, but most of the time it's an organization which in some form collects web pages from the live web, stores these, and then makes them available. It's not enough that we, as professionals in the field, have enough confidence to trust web archives, but this should extend to judges, historians, and the general public, of course. Trust in web archives does not mean that they should trust all the content. The content in a web archive is just a reflection of the broad spectrum of content on the web, that is including lies, disinformation, spam, and everything else. They should, however, be able to trust that web archives accurately represent the historical record. However, as we all know, web archives are very vulnerable to omissions, errors, and even malicious meddling. The internet is so vast and ever-changing that decisions need to be made what to archive and when. So it means that we don't have, by design, all the versions that were ever live on the web. Some websites can inherently not be archived. For example, if you have a search box, you cannot type all possible search combinations into the search box. The crawlers that were used in the past, and even those, the most modern ones that we have today, have technical limitations, which result in incomplete or even broken archives. Then, of course, the archive data needs to be stored for the long term, which also means that we have to make sure that it's not changed maliciously or even inadvertently. Then comes the step most visible to the users, and where most of us know that there are problems. It's the replay of the archive as something which ideally should represent something that looks like the live version of the page that used to exist sometime on the internet. However, as we will see, replay in particular is quite vulnerable and problematic, and there are even malicious attacks that are possible in replay. And finally, the last big risk that we have is that web archives can simply cease to exist. If there's no more funding, if there are no more public interest in running web archives or even private interest, they will simply disappear. The answers to these challenges will have to address the technical but also the organizational aspects. Only when we understand the issues and solve them, or at least limit their impact, can we place warranted trust in web archives and expect wider society to do the same. With all this being said, let me first introduce our first speaker, which is Michael Nelson. So please, Michael, if you could join me on stage. Michael Nelson is a professor of computer science at Old Dominion University, where he leads the Web Science and Digital Libraries Research Group. Hi, Michael. Great. His research interests include web archiving and the integrity of archived pages. He has co-authored over 260 technical publications and is co-editor of the specifications for OAI, ORE, and has a cat. So please, Michael, the floor is yours.
All right. Okay. So thank you. I'm and I'm going to talk to you about my vision for trusted web archiving in the year 2025. All right, and that involves hundreds of publicly available, independent, interoperable, robust, auditable, cooperating web archives. Now, I'm going to claim that this is doable by the year 2025, but we're going to look at some of the possible challenges that are involved. First, this notion of hundreds. All right, in the very beginning, there was the Internet Archive. And the Internet Archive is sort of the Walter Cronkite of web archives. It was the first, and we implicitly trust it. Web archives, now like news anchors, we have greater representation and points of view, but they don't all have the same gravitas as Uncle Walter or the most trusted man in America. Some of these participants intentionally deceive. All right. Now, do we have hundreds of archives? Well, that's an interesting question. So IIPC has more than 60 members, but there's not a one-to-one relationship with memberships and archives. On the other hand, there are web archives that exist that are active use that are not members of IIPC. So I don't know exactly what the number is. I think it's safe to say that we have dozens of web archives. Now, my concern is that number might not continue to grow. We have innumerable examples in adjacent fields that tend towards centralization or consolidation. And it's not a technology problem, it is an economic problem. On the other hand, we're going to look at publicly available. So about a couple of years ago, we estimated about 2/3 of web traffic is not publicly archivable, at least not in the way that you think it is. All right. And now, and at this conference, we've talked about personal web archiving tools, and they exist, but outside of this community, they're not in widespread use. Now, there are commercial activities that focus on digital preservation, and often that has a web component, but these commercial entities are not informed by the technology stacks that we use within the IIPC community. And there are also, unfortunately, there are dark web archives. There's really nothing that we can do about that. All right, independence. Now, in this example, we're talking to Memgator, and what we initially see are 3 observations of Joyanne Reed's blog in the year 2005 at exactly the same time. But when we dive in and really understand what happened, what we have is a single observation that we have 3 copies of. The Internet Archive, on behalf of the Library of Congress, did a crawl in 2005. So that was 1 observation, 2 copies, and then later Archive Today made a copy of that. Now, as we go back in time, it'll never be 2005 again, so we'll only have the Internet Archive's observations. But looking forward, I would like to see more observations to account for things like personalization, GeoIP, etc. Interoperability. All right, in interoperability, I'm concerned, going back to this notion of centralization and consolidation, that we are converging on a small set of high quality tech stacks and services. Now, I understand why we do that. These are really good stacks and services, but every time an independent archive closes or merges onto another platform, I lament the loss of heterogeneity. True operability comes about not from everybody running the same software or using the same service, but through the hard work of defining protocols and standards. Robustness. Now, in this case, I'm really excited to be on this panel because we have both Permacc and the work that Ada Lerner did in 2017, and I'm pretty sure that this work, this was the first time that anyone focused on what would happen when web archives ingest malicious JavaScript and HTML. In our group, we had looked at replay oddities, but until then, we had never really studied what happens when an archive ingests malicious stuff. This informed John Berlin's master's thesis from our group. He did an excellent job. I signed off on his thesis 3 years ago, and I'm just now really beginning to understand the work that he did. And then to finish up our panel, we have a really important paper from 2020 that focuses on the same vulnerabilities, but on rehosting services, including translation services and proxies, in addition to web archives. Auditable. Now, in this case, there's a lot to unpack in this slide, and this comes from Mohammed Adarban, and if you look on the web, you'll see this as an animated slide, so you're missing the animation here. But essentially, the green dots represent a resource that has been requested before, and a gray dot represents resources that are not being requested. And the takeaway message here is every time you hit or reload an archived web page, you get a slightly different version, and you cannot audit something that's different basically every time that you replay it. Go online, check out the animated GIF on this. All right, and this notion of cooperating, and a couple of years ago, I caught a lot of flack for talking about generational loss, where web archives are tuned to ingest anything except for the output of another web archive. Now, the fact that archives can't ingest the output of other archives is a problem of interoperability. The fact that we don't care enough to do anything about it is a lack of cooperation. I'm saying that this is an important problem. Now, I do want to mention the good job that Archive Today does of reading the machine-readable metadata and surfacing it in the UI. But we've talked about APIs, and they're super important, but they're necessary but not sufficient. It's not sufficient to audit the data. We need to audit the data as rendered through a playback interface. The next thing that we have is web. And these are some of the things I have on my phone. They probably use HTTP. They almost surely use JSON, but what's their URL? Are these things even web anymore? This is an increasing level of our experience, and they're not archived. Finally, this notion of archives, I want to remind everyone in this community that there's more to web archiving than just Wayback Machines. Basically, anything that has rehosting or supports native versioning, we have to treat as a web archive and manage to accommodate this. So to wrap up, my vision for web archiving, next slide, please. So is it achievable by 2025? Yes. Will we achieve it? Maybe, probably, maybe, I'm not sure. Will this solve trust? No, it will be an important first step, but I think trust is best understood as being similar to relevance in information retrieval, and it's ultimately defined by individual users' information need. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was very, very good and very interesting, very good starting talk. So let me introduce our next speaker, who's Ada Lerner. They are a computer scientist who focuses their research on the area of inclusive security and privacy, which they define as the study of the security and privacy needs of groups which are marginalized, such as queer and trans folks, for example, or which are critical of the to the functioning of our free society, such as lawyers, journalists, or activists. Their work incorporates interdisciplinary perspectives from a variety of areas, including psychology, feminist and queer theory, and the law. Please, Ada, thank you for already joining the stage. That's great. And please show us what you wanted to talk about.
Okay. Thank you, Yves. And thanks, Michael. That was a great sort of broad perspective. I'm going to focus in really tight, and I hope that as folks hear what I have to say about that paper that Michael mentioned, right? So I'm not an expert in web archives broadly. I had this one idea at one point that around web archives for a while, but I think the idea that's inherent in this work is really broad, which is that web archives are built on other technologies, and fundamentally the vulnerabilities that we explored in this paper are emerging because we looked specifically at the Wayback Machine. Sorry, Michael, we're looking at just the Wayback Machine here. Sorry, I'm gesturing with my hands. I'm actually going to say next slide to change slides.
Okay, sorry.
Because I wave my hands all the time, so I will look like I'm trying to progress the slide all the time. So I want to think broadly from this very specific example of how it is that being built on top of other technologies is going to cause trust issues. Next slide, please. So our goal here was to figure out if there are ways that we could make it so that someone looking at a archive snapshot in the Wayback Machine would see something incorrect, that someone as a malicious attacker could intentionally manipulate a snapshot in the Wayback Machine. For example, here, I've taken a Reuters.com page from 2011 and I've shoved a little shout out to the conference where this work appeared as a little bit of, sort of a brown nosing. Okay, next slide, please. And so in particular, the animation's missing here, but you see that snippet there that I've sort of slid up in place there. We were able to do this where that anyone on the web who went to see this page, this homepage of Reuters.com from 2011 on the Wayback Machine would have seen our content instead of theirs, instead of what was actually there in the past. And we were able to choose exactly what to put there. And I'll tell you how I was able to do that. Next slide, please. Oh, and I should mention that I immediately took this down after taking the screenshot and proving that I could do it. I took it down so that I wouldn't get in anyone's way. So the opportunity that allows this kind of thing to happen is that, so the Wayback Machine, one of the things that it does is it rewrites all the URLs before it serves them to you to point into the archive. So for example, if you have example.com/script.js, by the time your browser parses that, it should be looking for instead web.archive.org/some date timestamp /example.com/script.js. And this works a lot of the time, but for a variety of reasons, most commonly, I think, dynamic content generation, sometimes this rewriting process fails, and your browser will get the actual URL example.com/script.js and load content from the live web and mix that with archived content, which is obviously sort of an unintentional failure. But as a security person, whenever I see an unintentional failure or a sort of harmless failure, I immediately ask myself, okay, is there some way I can take advantage of this, or someone could take advantage of this? And my goal here is to do this without compromising the servers or compromising the client machines. So I'm not going to hack into anyone's servers, and I'm not going to break into your browser, but I'm going to do this entirely with things I'm allowed to do. And so my observation is that if you are example.com, you can now host anything you want at example.com/script.js. And then especially if that happens to be something like a JavaScript file, like it is in this case, that's going to allow you to change literally everything about the page. And so in this case, how was I able to do this? Next slide, please. As it turned out, Reuters.com in 2011 relied on an analytics service, and that analytics service went out of business. And so they allowed their domain name registration to lapse. And so I bought it for $12. And then I was able to host a script that was escaping from this page and modify the page to do literally anything that I wanted. Next slide, please. The other main, we find a number of attacks in the course of this work. I'll tell you about one other one, which happens when you find that resources are missing from a page. So you will visit a website visit a snapshot on the Wayback Machine, and you'll see that say a bunch of the images are missing, or some of the scripts are not being loaded, because even though the URL rewriting is happening correctly, somehow the crawler failed to capture those resources. So it's got the page that includes the resources, but it didn't get the resources themselves. And so in this case, you can take advantage of the fact that if I say, hey, Wayback Machine, I want the 2015 version of this thing, and it doesn't exist, if I then inject a version in 2021, it will start giving me the 2021 version. It will just find the nearest temporal match to the resource that I've asked. And so again, if you have control over example.com, you can actually go, you know how if you go to the Wayback Machine, you can say save page now. You can just ask it to archive whatever you currently have up, and you can choose to intentionally give it something malicious that will then, for then on, be what is loaded for that anachronistic resource that was originally missing from the crawl. Okay, next slide. And so we measured how frequent these were, and I was quite amazed when I did this work to find that they're extremely common. The first type of attack I described was present on around 70%. It was possible to execute this attack against around 70% of the top 500 websites as archived in the Wayback Machine on their snapshots. This number grows dramatically over time, I think because those websites became more and more and more dynamic. And as you recall, that vulnerability relies on the failure of URL rewriting so that you're loading external content, third-party content. And so as websites became more dynamic, we're generating more of their URLs live, then this attack became more common. You can see that the anachronism injection attack goes down over time in prevalence, probably because the crawler for the Wayback Machine got much better at collecting things. And so since that attack relies on missing resources, those became less common. Next slide, please. So we recommended a whole bunch of defenses in the course of the paper. We, of course, disclosed these results to the folks over at Internet Archive before publishing it. They are awesome. If you all are out there, thank you for being among the best people to work with when disclosing vulnerabilities. It is amazing the degree to which many institutions will become defensive and angry if you try to tell them about vulnerabilities in their systems. And the Wayback Machine, I was like, so this is the thing. And they were like, all right, here's what we're going to do to fix it. So they're really awesome people to work with. I love it. So I'll tell you about two defenses that they deployed. Next slide, please. This one I actually didn't recommend until they thought of it. It's really, really smart, which is that the first type of attack relies entirely on the browser, the client's browser, loading third-party content. And there's actually no reason to ever load third-party content in the course of rendering archival snapshot. And so what they did was they deployed a content security policy header, which is basically an instruction to the browser. And it says, hey, browser, please don't load content except from these particular domains. And this completely eliminates that attack. And so this is sort of an example of how if you have a specific attack, you can remove it. And yet I have this suspicion that similar attacks exist because we're still built on top of the web. And the web is meant to do way more than web archiving. So there's a lot to go wrong. Next slide, please. And in terms of defending against anachronism injection, what they decided to do based on our recommendations was to surface information about the timing of different resources. Next slide, please. And so you can see if you go to the Wayback Machine now, you can pull open this little informational timestamp window for any page, and you will see that it tells you if sub-resources within a snapshot have timestamps that are very far away from the timestamp of the snapshot that you're looking at. Obviously, this doesn't sort of automatically fix the problem, but this is a problem where the correct fix is very ambiguous. And so I think this is about as good as we can do. It surfaces information for experts to use. For example, say you were using this as a snapshot as evidence in court. Maybe you would have an expert witness whose job would be to say, I think we can trust this page because I look at all this information. Yes, I can post a link to my slides. Thank you. I'll do that when I'm off stage. Next slide, please. And that's what I have to say. The paper and everything is at rewritinghistory.cs/Washington.edu. I did this while I was a grad student at UW, and thanks, as I mentioned, to Mark Graham at the Wayback Machine and everyone on his team who was so helpful in this.
Thank you very much, Ada, and we'll hear more from you during the panel discussion. So our next speaker is Takuya Watanabe, a doctor in computer science. Since joining the Nippon Telegraph and Telephone Corporation, NTT, in 2016, he has been engaged in research and development of the cybersecurity project. He has given talks on offensive security at academic and industrial top conferences. His demonstration of new web attacks led to the introduction of his proposed new security mechanism in several well-known web services, as well as the adoption of the same site cookie in all modern browsers. So thank you very much, Takuya, and please start your talk.
Good. Thank you for introduction. Today, I will talk about the vulnerability found by analyzing web services from an attacker's perspective. Actually, this research is strongly inspired by Lerner's rewriting history paper, but this is more focused on browser-side behavior. Okay, next slide, please. We presented this study at NDSS 2020. In this work, we found the security flaws of web rehosting services, which will be explained later. We demonstrated 5 client-side attacks on real services, which can compromise the reliability of web archives. Finally, we provided effective countermeasures of the attacks to service providers. Next slide, please. We defined web rehosting as a type of services that have a feature to rehost existing websites. We found the 3 main categories that make up web rehosting services. Website translators, breaking down the language barrier from internet, and web archives, of course, having a great contribution to the preservation of the internet, and web-based proxies means of bypassing censorship and blocking. Our research revealed the security flaws common to these services. Next slide, please. Here I will describe architectures common to web rehostings. Basically, the content of pages rehosted by web rehostings are unchanged from its original content. However, the domain of each page is unified to the domain of the web rehosting. Next slide. In this figure, websites with different domain names, A example and B example, will be placed under a single domain name, rehosted example. That is, all different web pages placed on web rehosting will have the single origin. Origin is an important concept in web security. User data stored in the browser cannot be accessed by website in another origins by same origin policy. Next slide, please. With exploiting that architecture, a third-party attacker can intentionally place malicious content on the origin of web rehosting. The most important aspect of our study is that origin boundaries are removed for rehosted website. Next slide, please. I refer to the pages on web rehosting as rehosted pages and the attacker's page on web rehosting as rehosted malicious page. All of our attacks work by triggering the victim to access the rehosted malicious page. Okay. Given this architecture, I demonstrated 5 attacks against web rehostings. Of these, our experiments have shown that persistent man in the middle, privilege abuse, and history theft are effective against web archives. Next slide, please. First, I will explain attack 1, persistent man in the middle. When a user accesses a conference page directly, of course, the page will be displayed as usual. And when a user accesses the archived conference page on web archives, the page will be still displayed as usual. However, if user accesses the archived conference page after accessing the rehosted malicious page, the content can be intercepted and tampered with on the client side. When tampering is performed, users who browse to a legitimate website using web archives may see fake virus infection screens or fake news. Next slide, please. And service worker is a key browser feature to establish attack 1. This is an event-driven JavaScript that is registered in the user's browser and scopes requests and responses to other pages on the same origin. There are some security restrictions for using service workers, but they do not work for preventing attacks against web rehostings. Next slide. At first, the user visits a rehosted malicious page. Then the malicious page registered a service worker script in the user's browser. After that, the user uses web rehosting as usual. At this time, the registered service worker script intercepts all of the user's requests and responses to the web rehosting. Next slide, please. Let me talk about attack 2, privilege abuse. A user visits rehosted benign page. Sometimes the rehosted page asks the user for permission to use sensitive resources such as location data, camera, microphone, or notification. Once the users choose allow, the permission is granted to the origin of web hosting, not to the origin of the website user intended. Therefore, a rehosted malicious page can reuse the permission which is granted at the rehosted benign page by the user. Next slide, please. Attack 4 is a way to steal a user's browsing history through web rehosting. First, user visit rehosted benign pages, and the page writes cookie or local storage by using JavaScript. Some websites may write a unique string to the cookie or local storage. And the origin at this time is web rehosting. So rehosted malicious page can retrieve the data of cookies or local storage. Finally, the attacker estimates browsing history by using retrieved unique string. Next slide, please. This table summarizes all experimental results. Closed circles indicate that the service is vulnerable to each attack, and open circles indicate that it is secure. In the category of web archiving, we surveyed 3 services, Webpack Machine, Google Cache, and Freeze Page, that differed greatly in behavior. As a matter of fact, the Webpack Machine is the most affected by our attack. This is due to the fact that Webpack Machine tries to reproduce the JavaScript of a website almost perfectly. Next slide, please. Finally, I summarize the existing problems in the trust of web archives from the perspective of client security. A malicious attacker may expose users to threats from different directions, content tampering, and privacy violation. And the latest features of web, such as Service Worker or HTML5, may make a risk to the current web archive architectures. And compared to attacks against the server side, it is difficult to know exactly which users have been affected by client-side attacks. We hope that our research will lead to a more robust design of web archives. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Takuya. That is a little bit scary, I have to admit. So if you could turn your webcam off, I will briefly introduce our last speaker on the panel, who is Clare Stanton. She's the communications and outreach lead for Permacc. So Permacc is a user-directed citation preservation tool built and maintained at the Harvard Law School's Library Innovation Lab. Clare's role focuses mainly on conducting research, outreach, and user research for non-academic applications of Permacc's web archiving software. And please, Clare, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I also use my hands a lot, so I will be verbally saying this next slide.
You can also just say next, I'll understand.
So we can go to the next one right away. Great. So yeah, my name is Clare Stanton. For my portion of the session, I'm going to be sharing some pretty high-level thoughts that our team at Permacc have about trust and security in web archives as sort of a case study based on our very specific circumstances as a project that's funded and maintained at the Harvard Law School Library. So first, I'll do a little bit of explaining about the particulars of our situation for those who might be unfamiliar. And then I'll talk about how our positioning at an institutional library like Harvard Law School plays into long-term trust in preservation of permalinks. And then I'll wrap up with some aspects of our technical design that we see as safeguards to our trust and reliability. So you can go to the next slide. So to start, it's relevant to explain the mission of Perma and thus how it fits into the definition of an archive. Perma is designed and built primarily to be a citation tool for academics and folks working in the US court system. While we've expanded that user base over the past couple of years, the use case for Perma remains the same. And that's reflected in the fact that the main and for all intents and purposes, only access point to the Perma collection is via the permalink, which is a short URL that sends viewers to a contained playback of a recorded web archive. We don't expose on our site an access portal to search the collection in kind of the traditional library access way. And additionally, permalinks are opaque and only including an 8-digit GUID at the end of that perma.cc. They're only meant to appear in addition to a live link in a citation. And as such, our team does not play a curation role. Permalinks are made at specific request by the user. And other than setting policies for who has access and things like that, we kind of take a step back. And that dynamic alone removes kind of thorny questions about assessing significance or completion in a way that sets us up mostly as a third party. This is what the Harvard Law School's software says the web looked like on this day role, rather than this collection is a comprehensive look at X topic or the web as a whole. It leaves really two big questions about trust for permalinks. One is trust that they'll be around for a long time, quote unquote permanent, whatever that means in this space. And then two, that they're close to as accurate, again, whatever accuracy means in this day and age, from a technical point of view as possible. So the next slide. Now that sentence I just said, this is what the Harvard Law School library said, speaks to this dynamic of there being trust in an institution, and specifically our institution. We say that sentence all the time. It gets people kind of in the door and listening to what we have to say about link rot and about the volatility of the web. I don't really have time to get into the history of why the Harvard Law School is considered reliable or authoritative, or the problematic aspects of that assessment. But for the sake of this conversation, we can kind of take that as it is. Like I said, when it comes to trust in an archive, for us, it comes down to two elements. Trust that what you're seeing is accurate or trustworthy, and then trust that the preserved content will survive through time. And on that second point, there are two interconnected consequences of that name recognition that we have. And those are long-term funding and then kind of building of a network of trust. So you can go to the next slide. Long-term funding-wise, I'm going to point people to, and I can drop this in the chat later. Our Perma's DevOps engineer, Ben Steinberg, wrote a really interesting blog post a couple years ago about digital preservation being at its core about maintaining people who are going to be able to be maintainers of a system and an archive and digital preservation. Harvard's longstanding commitment to libraries helps build that trust. And again, we can take issue with the details of that, but the nearly 400-year track record of our libraries points more towards longevity than volatility. And the school's commitment to the project is super essential, and they've made that commitment to us. It's worth saying that sometimes just like taking Harvard's word for it might not be a complete answer. So we also look to our network of partners and users as an element of our long-term sustainability. The Harvard name has helped us build collaborations and connections with other academic libraries across the country to strengthen the impact of the use of permalinks. And at a certain point, our user base became an important enough part of HLS's commitment to the legal record that it was solidified. It's kind of created this feedback loop of solidifying the institution's commitment to the collection, and then that builds trust, and we kind of have a nice little cycle. So the next slide, pointing to that kind of commitment and just kind of strength in numbers. The vast majority of law schools in the US use Perma in their academic journal publications. And then next slide. We're also seeing an ever-growing contingent of federal courts and judges and litigators and just general libraries using Perma to preserve the historical record, which again creates that feedback loop to the decision makers at Harvard who have a very deep interest in the legal record as a whole. Okay, so next slide. So next I'm going to talk about how our mission has manifested into some technical decisions that get at the idea of trust and reliability as well. So we do have the privilege to really lean into a specific use case, which allows for some exploration of different ways of archiving the web. One of the biggest factors of trust and reliability that we see from the design of Perma is the fact that we create and serve discrete works for each of our permalinks, meaning when you're looking at a playback on Perma.cc, there's no possibility for the temporal violations that Ada was talking about earlier, because all of the assets were captured and packaged into that permalink at the exact time that the user requested its creation. So next slide. This is something that has consequences for scale. There are a lot of duplicates in our collection in that sense, as there are certainly repeat captures across our entire user base. Like, for example, you can see this capture of the Supreme Court's website looks exactly the same, but the capture data is slightly different. In both cases, the entire page was captured. And again, due to our mission as a citation tool, we do consider each time that a page is being referenced as an important independent snapshot of time. So often for someone writing a court opinion or a brief, it does in fact matter what exact date and time content was captured. And this design decision was one that was made initially because of use case reasons, but especially in light of work that folks on this panel have been doing, it has become something of an approach that we see as an important experimentation in the pursuit of more accurate and reliable archive security. And then next slide. And then finally, we're privileged as an academic adjacent project to be able to completely open source our code. There's always an added layer of trust and transparency, we think. So from top to bottom, you can see how Perma is functioning, where all the specifics of how headers are requested and what user agent's being used. And the more complicated the web becomes, and the more your location and browser fingerprint and the time you were looking at things, and et cetera, affect what you're seeing online, the more important it is to be open about how exactly capturing software is functioning. So last slide, those are kind of the big tentpole ideas. You can go to the next one, sorry.
I'm sorry, I had a freeze there.
Okay.
Am I still here?
You are here. It appears the slide is still up.
Okay.
The last one just has text. It's not super important.
Okay.
But this is kind of us. I just shared kind of the big tentpole ideas about kind of the current state of Perma and for the current stack that we're working with, but it's an ever evolving question. So some of the big topics on our minds of the developers on our team are things like implementing some of that. This is what Harvard Law School says, trust in a technical way. So currently that trust is translated through the fact that we serve and host permalinks ourselves, but it'd be great if that could exist as a technical aspect of the files. Also exposing things like more metadata about the contents and how they were created, things like I said, being really transparent about browser fingerprints and things like that. And then finally, at a broader scale, we're thinking about more ideal networked and redundant storage options. So that is what I have to share today. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. And I'm going to stop showing the slides. So, and I will ask everybody to come on stage, including Martin, who will take the discussion from this point.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much to all four of you, and thank you, Yves, for running the show thus far. One of the fun things about organizing a panel is that you get first dibs at asking questions, and so I'm planning on taking full advantage of that. However, I noticed that we have a number of questions in the Q&A tool already, and I encourage everybody to chime in there as well and leave your questions in the Q&A tool and or the chat, whichever you find more convenient, and we'll do our best to get to those. If you have a particular panelist that you'd like to address your question, then please indicate that in your question. Otherwise, we'll either find someone or ask someone to volunteer, or nobody will answer the question. And of course, you can, as always, you've seen this by now, you can upvote particular questions that are already there if you like them. Okay, so let me start by asking two questions, and we have, according to a schedule, like 14 minutes to go, so that's good. So Michael had alluded to this in his talk, and Clare has given a really nice explanation of one of the great examples of multiple archives, right? What sort of organizational entities, non-profit, for-profit, academic, government, maybe even, and the corresponding business models do you see potentially most likely to succeed in this space? And maybe as an angle to that, can personal archives play a role here? Because that seemed to be a completely different approach. So this is a question for anybody who wants to take it.
So I think it's the role of memory organizations to undertake web archiving. So at IIPC, those are well represented, especially in Europe. There's all the national libraries, the national archives, and so forth. What Permacc is doing at Harvard, I mean, Harvard is a great organization to do this. We would like to see this replicated in other domains. Permacc is sort of primarily focusing on the legal area, which, that's where it comes from, and that's its sort of primary customers. Even rolling back in history, Web Citation was focused in medical literature. Unfortunately, they didn't really hit on the right business model, and so that's now, it's been up and down and now in a read-only state. So yeah, it might come with each domain coming up with something that's relevant to their area, augmented by memory organizations. As far as personal web archiving, I think what we might eventually see are companies that essentially host your work files for you, and you can turn them off and on private. And they might be able to even vouch for, this is a work file that we've had for the last 5 years, even though it just became visible yesterday, right? Because otherwise I can manufacture my own work files and say, I archived something. I archived your page that said something crazy, and I did that 5 years ago. And then we have less trust instead of more trust, right? So that's the only thing that I haven't seen really emerge. Like, all the tools for people generating their own work files happen, but we just haven't figured a company that will host everything on individuals' behalves.
Yeah, I +1 to everything Michael just said, and example of Perma being at the end of the day a pretty domain-specific tool to the legal sphere is really relevant, and it's something that we have opened up access to the platform, but only we don't offer free service to folks outside of that original use case, which has been an interesting exploration of viability and sustainability still being worked out. I think at the end of the day, it probably will be different domains figuring out what works best for their type of work. One really interesting lane that we've been in recently is working more with journalists and fact checkers who, because of the nature of their work, it really kind of moves the necessity for the act of web archiving back to the journalists themselves. Like, I do believe that it's memory institutions and libraries that are going to be the kind of long-term arbiters of this type of work, but the actual act of archiving, at least for folks who are writing about stuff that disappears extremely quickly off the web, that responsibility is being pushed farther and farther back towards the original writers. And that speaks again to the need to have some sort of technical way to be tracing reliability and things like that, because if they're going to get passed along, it's not going to be originally made at a museum or library archive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So maybe let me follow up with another question there. So Eda's and Takuya's findings scared all of us, or at least you should be scared, right, to an extent. However, it strikes me as not, at least not yet, being a mainstream area of research and development, right? It's still kind of a niche to an extent. However, given the threat model that you outlined and the scare factor that comes with it, what do you think it would take for us to get there, to put this more in the foreground on people's minds, basically? Do we need some sort of a Black Friday, right, to raise awareness? And maybe what do you think, what sort of a role the IIPC and the IIPC community could play in this context? volunteers?
You look like you're about to say something, Takuya. Maybe not.
Right.
I could say, I guess, from my perspective, I wonder, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but do we need it to be a widespread issue of, right? Because there are certain segments of people who, thinking with my sort of inclusive security and privacy lens on here, there are certain people, journalists, lawyers, you know, the whole legal system, the whole journalistic system, who care about this and should care about this, and whose job is to care about this. And I'm not sure that it matters whether anyone else knows any of this is happening, in the same sense that there are lots of important processes happening within those systems that most people are completely unaware of most of the time. So my sense at the time, I mean, so this reminds me a little bit of so I did some work building usable encrypted email systems for lawyers and journalists. And we interviewed a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of journalists. And one of the things that surprised me was sort of especially when talking to lawyers, that some of them were saying, like, I care about the way this technology influences the legal system as I interact with it, right? I care about encrypted email specifically because I care about how that might enable me to say that I deserve attorney-client privilege in this situation. And basically saying, I don't care if it's actually secure. What I care about is whether I can prove to the judge that I'm taking reasonable steps, and the judge will give me the legal rights and privileges, right? And having the sense from some of them that most of the lawyers out there are not thinking of this at all, right? I mean, when I communicated with granted, it was just a real estate lawyer, you know, over buying a house, we just emailed everything completely, you know, no regard to security of any kind. So I think it is worth thinking about, for the domains where it really matters, how can we convey some of these things? How can we make this a bigger deal? Because I think it really is an important thing, because there are really big incentives for attackers to deploy attacks when, you know, I could not go to jail, or my company could not lose billions of dollars because I managed to manipulate a web archive, or I managed to exploit a web archive, or I managed to even just compromise a web archive such that evidence against me isn't good enough, right? And I can get away with something. Isn't trusted by the court or by the jury or something. So I guess that's my take.
Just to add to that, we've been talking with, like I mentioned, a lot of journalists recently, and have been finding, it's not the exact same thing, but trying to get them to care about link rot in their articles, and there being kind of a side door reason for them to care about it is getting at their own business model of there being a really big effect on their SEO if there's a lot of 404s on their website, and that kind of being a driver for folks who are not already kind of embedded in security or memory institutions or things like that. That extra angle has been, we were talking about business models, Martin.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I guess another thing that comes to my mind here was hearing folks talk about sort of personal web archiving and very distributed web archiving. The privacy person in me says, oh my goodness, if everyone is capturing web archives of everything that they do on the internet, that sounds really scary. You know, who is going to, can we do that in a privacy preserving way? Can we do that in a way that, you know, I know who has access to those and who can use those? I mean, we kind of have a little bit of that going on with, you know, the major tech companies knowing everything we do online right now, and also very often capturing a lot of, certainly Google captures a lot of what the web looks like all the time, and sort of being able to merge that together. So that's on my mind too.
Michael, I think you had a comment there.
Yeah, so I used to, as you know, I used to be very concerned that there would be a big event involving deep fakes and backdated metadata in the web archive to prove that it was there. I backed off a little bit on that, not because it's not a threat, but because cheap fakes are so effective, right? You can just post something today and say, oh, I definitely saw that 5 years ago, and everyone will believe it anyway. So I used to be super concerned that web archives would be used as this weapon, but now, you know, maybe they're not even necessary for that.
Yeah, all right, cool. Okay, cool. So we have a few minutes to go, so maybe we'll take a few questions from the audience. So in looking at the Q&A tool, maybe we'll just go by the highest ranked questions in that order. The first one is from Ilya Kramer, and it's addressed to Michael. You say web archives should be audited as rendered. Would the ability to audit work records, which are standardized, help determine if raw data is bad, quote unquote, or just the replay is broken?
Right. So as I said in my slide, the auditing the data is necessary but not sufficient, right? So we want to know whether or not the work out. Of course, how do we do that, right? Somebody else has to either have the work or have the hashes from your work, right? You just can't serve up a work today and say, oh, I swear it's always hashed to this value if there's no independent observation. But users ultimately experience archive content through some replay, either a Wayback Machine, or they're taking the work file and replaying it in some local client or something like that. And ultimately, it's that thing, right? So if we have a PowerPoint or a Word file and we say, well, it used to animate this image, but I loaded up in Word 2004 and it doesn't animate something, even if the data hasn't changed, people experience binary files through playback interfaces. So we have to have some mechanism to say, well, this thing used to blink or flash or whatever it used to do, and it doesn't do that now, even if it's binary equivalent to something that we used to have. So yeah, APIs necessary, but not sufficient.
I mean, it feels relevant also to code, right? Part of a web archive is all the JavaScript. That JavaScript could be designed to do something different when run inside of a web archive or when run at a certain time in time, and it could be obfuscated in a way that it's very hard to tell that.
Yep.
That's another good point. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So another question that I want to take from Brenda, asking Takuya and Ada, sorry. In your opinion, given the relative low awareness of web archives amongst the general public, what are the most important / high priority vulnerabilities from your research? Takuya, do you want to take that? Yeah, please go ahead.
In my research, attacks with service workers are the most threatening, I think. Most users are unlikely to think that all content could be tampered with, as the service workers themselves are not well known. So I think service workers, it needs mechanisms to alert users risk of service worker, or user can easily remove service worker script from browser. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ada, anything you would like to add to that?
I guess I would just say, I mean, I probably sound like a broken record player here, but talk to the users. Talk to the users who are using this for really important uses. I guess calling back again to the lawyer journalist work that I did, one of the things that I was really surprised with when I interviewed lawyers and journalists about encrypted email is that I told you what lawyers wanted, right? They wanted to be able to regain legal rights by saying they'd taken reasonable steps. Journalists didn't want that at all. They basically said, this is useless to me. Because they basically said, email reveals metadata, and I can't let anyone know who I talk to, because the mere fact of talking to a journalist will get me fired, right? Or throw to jail for national security reasons. And so it seems to me that it's dangerous to ask a bunch of technologists like us, well, what should the most important thing for us to work on be? When maybe you should instead be saying, hey, which of these things do you actually rely on, or would you actually rely on if they worked, to the really important stakeholders, the politicians, the activists, the journalists, the doctors, the so on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for that. So I realize we're out of time. So in the interest of trying to stay, roughly on schedule, I propose that we close out here this session. I realize that there are a few questions in the Q&A tool that are unanswered. So maybe get in touch with the panelists individually For those who have not seen their question answered, I apologize. Maybe after the next session, that's a good opportunity to catch the folks and their attention. I'm sure everybody would be willing and happy to answer questions via Slack or via email and all the other channels, name your poison there as well. So with that, there's nothing left to do for us other than to thank you all again. We really appreciate you being here. Your contribution. This was, I think, an incredible panel, well received, with lots of questions, and very interactive mode. So that was really great. Thank you very much.